Human trafficking is a growing problem in the United States and around the world. Michigan, with its large international border, makes it a destination for human trafficking in the United States. Michigan has many amenities and activities that draw tourists from around the world to visit the state. It also has beautiful scenery, coupled with outdoor activities. There are major outdoor tourist attractions that include the Isle Royale National Park, Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, and the Great Lakes. Michigan is also home to major sports teams and other tourist activities. The state has chosen to host large conventions and trade shows. Michigan also has proximity to the Midwestern United States and the Canadian border. Michigan has excellent infrastructure with multiple interstate highways and a freeway system that allows for fast transportation. However, the same economic forces that fuel tourism in Michigan also support human trafficking. Trafficking is not a victimless crime. In 2018, 1 out of 7 endangered runaways reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were suspected victims of human trafficking. The average age of a child first forced into sex trafficking is around 14 years old nationally. Approximately 75% of prostituted people report being homeless at one point. Approximately 90% of prostituted people claim they want to escape the profession but have no other options. Prostituted women have a 200% greater chance of dying than non-prostituted women. Approximately 70% of prostituted people reported being raped. Approximately 60% of prostituted people reported PTSD symptoms. Human trafficking can happen to anyone, but some people are more vulnerable than others. Significant risk factors include recent migration or relocation, substance use, mental health concerns, involvement with the child welfare system, and being a runaway or homeless youth. Often traffickers identify and leverage their victims' vulnerabilities in order to create dependency. Numerous factors can compel an individual to be exposed to or enter situations with a high risk for trafficking. Some of these factors include a history of instability in the family, poverty, or if there has been gang involvement. If there is a prior history of sexual or physical abuse by parents, guardians, or others in the victim's lives. Additional risk factors include if there is a history of substance use by the victim or members of the victim's family. There is a higher likelihood if there is a history of child welfare involvement in their family, adverse childhood experiences, past trauma in their lives, or if they had a history of running away from home. Some of the victims are kicked out of their homes because of their sexual orientation, which could make them at a higher risk of being trafficked. There are various types of traffickers that use different methods to influence and control their victims. Perpetrators of human trafficking span all racial, ethnic, and gender demographics and are as diverse as survivors. Some use their privilege, wealth, and power as a means of control, while others experience the same socioeconomic oppression as their victims. They include victims, business owners, members of a gang or network, parents or family members of victims, or intimate partners. Traffickers are master manipulators that hone in on an individual's insecurities and exploit them. The first type of trafficker is the Romeo Pimp. They will begin grooming their victims by being the boyfriend or girlfriend that they never had. They show them affection and love. When you look at someone who comes from a family of instability and they do not have a positive role model, the Romeo Pimp will appear to be a knight in shining armor. They make the victim feel loved and accepted, and the pimp is that missing piece that they have been looking for in their life. The next type of trafficker is the Finesse Pimp. This type of pimp is a very smooth talker and operator. They can manipulate and exploit victims through their words. They use words to control them and ingratiate themselves into the victim's life. Both the Romeo and Finesse Pimps can quickly turn into a guerrilla pimp. When love and affection are not working anymore, when talking is not working anymore, the pimp will turn into a guerrilla pimp. Unfortunately, they switch up their tactics and they turn to physical or sexual violence towards the victim. The pimp knows that those people he is trafficking are what bring him revenue, so he will use violence to force compliance. The violence employed gains control over the victim to the point where they believe the negative message the pimp is telling them. Another type of trafficker is gangs. Gangs exploit a victim's desire for a sense of belonging and inclusion. If the victim had a difficult home life and wants to feel safe, secure, and included, the gang will exploit those feelings to manipulate the victim into becoming trafficked. Another type of trafficker is familiar traffickers, who could be family members or parents. They will trade their children or family members for drugs, alcohol, or to pay their rent. All traffickers will take advantage of victims' circumstances and exploit insecurities. If a victim is experiencing economic hardship, a trafficker will exploit the situation. If a victim is experiencing violence or instability in the home, the trafficker will manipulate the victim into believing they offer safety and security. In instances of natural disasters, traffickers will exploit the situation and manipulate people into being trafficked. Traffickers will not allow anyone near the victims. They are very controlling and control every aspect of those that are being trafficked. They do not allow anyone in the group to speak. The trafficker is the only one that can speak on behalf of any of the victims. They may intentionally drug or over-medicate victims to force compliance. They may force victims to use alcohol or drugs. The victim has no control over any aspect of their life and will need to ask permission to eat, sleep, or use the bathroom. Traffickers will use different strategies to manipulate victims. They will use violence or the threat of violence to force victims to obey, or they could use psychological coercion to manipulate their victims by telling them that no one other than the trafficker cares about them or their well-being. In both sex and labor trafficking, the ultimate goal of the trafficker is to gain power and control over their victims. They use coercion and threats against the victim and their families. They intimidate their victims by use of force or harming others. They use emotional abuse to humiliate the victim and create psychological dependence. They isolate victims and foster distrust between law enforcement and victims. They minimize, deny, or blame the victim. They make light of the abuse or the situation and deny that anything illegal is occurring. They place the blame on the victim for the trafficking situation. They use sex abuse to control the victim and normalize sexual violence and selling sex. They use privilege to manipulate victims. They treat victims like servants and use certain victims to control other victims. They utilize economic abuse and create debt bondage that can never be repaid. There are many ways that traffickers can use to get power and control over their victims. It is important to understand the mindset of a sex trafficking victim. Frequently, the victims will have a fear and distrust of people in authority positions, such as social service providers, law enforcement, and government officials. They have a fear of being deported or arrested. Often they are unaware that what is being done to them is a crime. Far too often, they do not consider themselves victims. Sex trafficking